On September the 11th, 2001, Colin Powell was Secretary of State of the United States. That day set in motion a series of events and decisions that had far-reaching implications, and Powell was a crucial part in all of them. But perhaps more than any other moment, it was his speech at the United Nations, in which Powell painted a picture of Iraq as a grave military threat because of its access to weapons of mass destruction. That would signify his role and eventually come to haunt him.
Saddam Hussein and his regime are busy doing all they possibly can to ensure that inspectors succeed in finding absolutely nothing. Look at the image on the left. On the left is a close-up of one of the 4 chemical bunkers. The 2 arrows indicate the presence of sure signs that the bunkers are storing chemical munitions.
Colin Powell has left the political arena, and we caught up with him to reflect on 9/11 and how the world has changed, or not really changed, since that day. We began by asking him what he did when he first heard the news of the attacks.
I have to start with the beginning of the day. I'm at a breakfast with the president of Peru, President Toledo, and we're talking about textile quotas. He wanted greater access to high-quality Peruvian cotton, something I'm an expert in.
Yes.
But that's what was important to him. And then suddenly a note gets handed to me by my assistant saying a plane has hit the World Trade Center. He even said it might be a light plane or a little plane. And so I just thought about it for a moment because things like that happen. But then a few moments later, he came in with a second note saying the second tower has been hit by a plane. And then I knew it was a terrorist attack. President Toledo was getting the same information, and I just turned and said, get the plane ready. So we had to get our plane ready to fly back home. But there was enough time for me to go to the meeting that I was there for, which was a meeting of the Organization of American States. And all of the foreign ministers in the Organization of American States was there to endorse an Inter-American Charter of Democracy. This is how we will behave in this region: representative government, democracy, open speech, and things like that. And so I went to the meeting, and they were all there, and I told them what had happened, and I thanked them for their expressions of condolences and also for their support. They were going to give us support. And in short order, rather than debate this Inter-American Charter of Democracy, they knew I had to leave, and they voted it by acclamation. And it was the first expression that we got that day of an international organization saying, we're with you, and we are endorsing democracy. We will not be terrorized. And I flew home with that. The 8 hours flying home was a long period of time. Very bad communications back to the United States, no telephone and radio communications. And I only had about 2 or 3 conversations to learn what was going on. Landed in Washington, had concern about my own building, the State Department, which might have been a target, and then went to the White House to meet with the other members of the national security team and begin to figure out how we're going to respond to this.
On the plane, your thoughts, what were your thoughts about, you hear planes in the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, the plane goes down in Shanksville, and you think, how quickly did your thoughts turn to the lives lost? At that point, we didn't have calculations, we didn't have figures, but you're familiar with all of those sites and all those locations.
Yeah.
How quickly did your thoughts turn to the lives lost?
Immediately. I mean, I'm a New Yorker. The World Trade Center was in my hometown. I'm also a Pentagon denizen. I lived in that building for years. And so immediately I thought of the lives lost. And I immediately thought of, how do we get after these people? How do we get them? I also knew that the American people were going to have a level of outrage and anger. Outrage that had to be dealt with, but anger that had to be modulated so that we applied that anger in the right way and didn't start doing things that might not have been in our interest. And I also knew that my job would be to rally the international community. While the President and Secretary Rumsfeld and my other colleagues are focusing on law enforcement and military action, I had to rally the international community. And so the very next morning, after we kind of got ourselves together, that's what I focused on. And within the shortest imaginable period of time, NATO, the European Union, the Organization of the Islamic Community, every international outfit that was out there indicated their support, voted to support us. NATO, for the first time in history, invoked Article 5 of the treaty, which says NATO has been attacked, not just the United States.
Do you believe, as so many have expressed and will continue to express in the days and certainly the years to come, that the events on 9/11 changed the world? Do you believe that as a general principle?
As a general principle, it changed the world in some ways, and it did not change the world in other ways. It changed the world in that everybody now realized that terrorism, we've seen acts of terror. It's something that happens in Jerusalem. It's something that occasionally happens in Northern Ireland.
Spain, Bali.
That was kind of all afterwards, really.
Yes.
But we realize now that, my gosh, there are people out there who will go after anybody to make the case. And this has to be, therefore, a worldwide response to terrorism, and not just, oh, isn't that terrible, what happened there, what happened there. Everybody had to get involved. And it succeeded in changing the world in that way. It changed us in that we understood that we were now in a permanent conflict. Call it a war, whatever you choose to call it. Don't care about that particularly. So we had to guard ourselves, defend ourselves, deter others trying to do it, and go after them. We had to go on the offense. So that changed us and changed the world to a large extent. But at the same time, as I tell all of the people that I speak to, all the audiences that I have the privilege of addressing, it can't be allowed to change us. We are still an open, freedom-loving people, reaching out to the rest of the world, welcoming people to come to this country. Because if we changed ourselves, then the terrorists won.
Let me talk about the rest of the world. Let me pick up on that part of your comment there. When you look at Afghanistan right now, what are your concerns about Afghanistan? Is it a strengthening democracy, or is it a democracy 10 years later that is still so fragile that it could fall into the hands of the Taliban once NATO forces leave 2014?
I'll make the first point I'd like to make is Al-Qaeda is no longer a significant presence in Afghanistan, which is what the original mission was. There's still some presence in Pakistan, but they're not the Al-Qaeda they were 10 or 11 years ago, and that's good. With respect to Afghanistan itself, I think it is a fragile democracy. It is holding elections. It has a legislature, but there's a great deal of corruption, and there's a great deal of inefficiency in the government. And right now, it is the presence of U.S. forces and NATO forces that are really giving the backbone to that country to deal with the Taliban and other elements that are trying to bring it down. So it is a fragile democracy, but increasingly, the destiny of that country is going to have to rest in the hands of the Afghan people and its army, its police force, and its political leadership. The United States and NATO cannot stay there forever.
Are you in any way disappointed that we're still talking about Al-Qaeda? We're still talking about the Taliban 10 years later? We knew they were in Afghanistan, and you've said in the past that the war in Afghanistan put them on the run, but it didn't destroy them. So are you disappointed in any way that we're even still talking about?
Well, I don't know how you can destroy something like that totally, and that would not be my measure of effectiveness. My measure of effectiveness is, are they anything like they used? Can they pull off the kind of thing they did 10 years ago? My answer to that is with very, very great difficulty, and it's unlikely.
When you look at Pakistan, a key ally, what are your concerns about Pakistan right now? You can make an argument that President Musharraf agrees to work with you in the United States in the so-called war on terrorism, and that sets off extremists inside of Pakistan, fueled by some of the ideology of the Taliban, and now you have a very polarized Pakistan. What are your concerns about Pakistan?
Concern, deep concern, and in fact, I'm as concerned about Pakistan as I am Afghanistan. As you noted, President Musharraf was a great supporter of ours right after 9/11. And I still remember the day I called him, and we had put down some demands asking him to help us and abandon the Taliban. And he did that. And his first request of us was not only to provide the funds for what he had to do militarily, but he wanted economic assistance. That was his greatest need. he is no longer in power in Pakistan, and there's a civilian government once again. But that government is fragile, and it is under assault by Taliban and by dissident elements within the country. And so I think that the Pakistani leadership, especially the military and the intelligence forces, have no choice to go after these folks in the frontier provinces. They can't allow them to have a sanctuary from which they can attack into Afghanistan, but at the same time they'll be attacking Pakistan. So I think that we have to keep the pressure on the Pakistani military and Pakistani intelligence forces and the government to keep going after these people, as difficult as it is. And they take lots of casualties doing it.
General Powell, everyone in our international audience, if they had an opportunity to sit here and talk to you, would ask you, I'm sure, a couple of questions. One that I'm sure they would ask you is the one I'm about to ask you now. Do you have any misgivings, any second thoughts, any regrets about the Security Council speech, 2003, Saddam Hussein, weapons of mass destruction, Iraq?
Of course I do. I gave that speech on 4 days' notice based on an intelligence estimate that had been done months before and provided to Congress. And every word in that speech was gone over by the Director of Central Intelligence and his Deputy Director and all of their experts. And up till 2 o'clock in the morning of that day, they verified everything that was in that speech. So it was nothing that I made up. It was nothing that I stuck in there. And in fact, some people tried to stick extra things in there that the intelligence community wouldn't verify with multi-sourcing, and I said no. And so when I presented that information, it was information that the President believed in, information that my colleagues in government believed in the national security world, Mr. Cheney, Mr. Rumsfeld, Dr. Rice. It was information that the United Kingdom and other nations believed in. And so I presented the best evidence that we had. It was evidence that persuaded the Congress of the United States months earlier to pass overwhelmingly a resolution of support if the President decided that military action was required. And so that's the basis upon which I presented it. Now, because it was me and because it was the UN, it became, a huge event, which is what we wanted it to be.
And chiefly because it was you and your standing in the country,
That's
the
why
great
that's
respect.
why I was sent to do it.
Yes.
But it turned out, as we discovered later, that a lot of the sourcing that had been attested to by the intelligence community was wrong. Imagine how I felt the day that they finally came in and said to me, well, we don't have 4 independent sources for that biological warfare van. It's one guy, and he's loopy, and he's in a German jail, and we've never talked to him. Hello? And I'm sitting there
Well, how
stuck
did
with
you
this.
feel?
I felt terrible. And 6 months later, the intelligence community is still standing behind their original judgments, even though nothing has been found. I understood the consequences of that failure, and as I've said on many occasions, I deeply regret that the information, some of the information, not all of it, some of the information I presented, which was multi-source, was wrong. And it is a blot on my record. But, there's nothing I can do to change that blot. All I can say is I gave it the best analysis that I could of all of the information that was there. But we have to remember, it came from a national intelligence estimate agreed to by the intelligence community. There may have been 1 or 2 dissents, and when there was a dissent, I included that. The aluminum tubes, thought they were for centrifuges, but I noted in my presentation there are other points of view about that. And so
within
we tried
the
to
State
qualify.
Department, within your intelligence services?
Within our intelligence services, the Department of Energy had a different view. My guys were not sure, but it was determined by the Director of Central Intelligence and his deputy and his others that no, we're pretty sure this is what it's for.
John McLaughlin, George Tenet.
Right, but even then I qualified that because there were differences of opinion about it. But you essentially get the information and you accept it or you don't accept it. The Congress had accepted it. The intelligence committees that called for the National Intelligence Estimate accepted it. And many of the people who subsequently were critical of it were those who voted on the basis of that intelligence estimate.
So as we reflect
But do I regret it? Of course I do. Yeah.
You do regret it.
Of course.
You mentioned the consequences a moment ago. So we're reflecting on the 10 years since the September 11th attacks. When you reflect on Iraq and the toll of Iraq, there certainly is the removal of Saddam Hussein, but there are the millions of people, Iraqis, who were displaced. 4,000, more than 4,000 American soldiers lost their lives, as you know. When you reflect in totality on the toll of Iraq, a case that you helped make, what do you think?
You always regret loss of life, but you passed over something very quickly. A terrible dictator is gone. A dictator who spent most of his years in power killing his own citizens and oppressing his own people. That's gone. That dictatorship, that whole government, is gone. That's good. The Iraqis have been given the opportunity to have a democratic form of government where they elect their own leaders. They've been given the opportunity to live in peace with their neighbors, to use the natural resources that they have, the oil that they have, in order to build a proper economy. I regret every loss of life, both Americans and the loss of lives of the Iraqis. But what was it caused by? It was caused by an insurgency. It was caused by an insurgency where they began fighting with each other, and mostly Sunni-led insurgency, but then the Shias got involved in it as well.
Promoted by Al-Qaeda, that wasn't in Iraq until the U.S. goes into Iraq.
I didn't say it was promoted by Al-Qaeda, you did.
Yeah.
It was initially promoted by, suddenly, this Shia-dominated regime that had oppressed not only Sunnis, but others, and Shias as well. The Marsh Arabs come to mind. It was gone. And all of the tension that existed within that country from years before exploded, and people had the ability now to fight with each other as opposed to being oppressed by Saddam Hussein. If there's one regret I have, is that we should have anticipated that this might happen. And one way to have prevented it, perhaps, one cannot be absolutely positive, if we had put in a large U.S. force, much more than we put in, and essentially taken control of the place, I think the Iraqis would have welcomed it, as opposed to watching it sort of fall apart with ministries being burned and people being killed, and we sort of standing around looking at this.
Munitions depots being looted.
Being looted. And even though this was discussed in our meetings and assurances were given that these places were under control, they were not under control. And so I was glad when Baghdad fell. I was glad when Saddam Hussein had to go hide in a cave. But I think we made some very serious errors in the post-Baghdad falling period, where we didn't take control of the country. And as I had said to the president, once you break this, you own it. And we didn't act like we owned it. And by owning it, I mean just own it long enough so you can stabilize it and then give it back to the Iraqis.
How do you answer the "was it worth it" question?
It's a difficult question, and history will have to make the final judgment. Because if history sees a few years hence that the Iraqi people are living in peace, that they have a representative form of government, that they're using their natural resources to benefit their people, that it's a non-corrupt government, that it is not being imposed upon by any outside power, then I think a case can be made good. Loss of life, always painful, always regrettable, but it was the insurgency that caused most of the loss of life. And if that insurgency had not broken out, if we were able to control the situation initially, then it might not have seen that, we might not have seen that extensive loss of life.
I'm born in the 10 years since the 9/11 attacks, and my mom takes me to one of the events where you're the speaker. I get an opportunity to speak to you, and I ask, why was America attacked on 9/11? September 11, 2001. What do you say? Why was America attacked?
Because there are people out there who to be blunt and to use words that President Bush used, they hated us. They hated our presence in the Middle East, they say. These were not poor, oppressed Muslims. These were people of means. But they developed a hatred for Western values. They developed a hatred for the United States. They developed a hatred for their own countries because those countries, such as Saudi Arabia, were friends and partners of the United States. And they felt that by acts such as 9/11 or what's happened in Britain and Bali and Spain and elsewhere, it was their belief that they could fundamentally bring us down and change us and make us so afraid, so terrified. That's what terrorism is all about, to terrify someone, that we would fundamentally start to collapse inside and allow them to rise to a position of increasing power. That didn't happen. The message I give to all of my audiences is that 9/11 was terrible. We're a lot safer now. We've put in place defenses, we have deterrence activities to keep people from being able to do this, and we've gone on the offense against them, and we've pretty much, I think, neutered Al-Qaeda compared to the Al-Qaeda of 10 or 11 years ago. They haven't gone, but we've done a hell of a job on them. But the one thing we have to be careful about is that we have to understand that something could happen again. It may not be another 9/11, but terrorists are still out there. They're still trying. We even have homegrown terrorists. And we have to be vigilant. But remember, we're still America. We have to remain an open, welcoming country. We can't shut ourselves off from the rest of the world. I want people to come here. I want them to send their kids to our schools. I want them to come to Disneyland.
So you want a visa program that allows that to happen?
I absolutely want that to happen, because if we don't let that happen, then we've changed ourselves. And the terrorists can say, that's what we wanted. Well, they're not going to get it.
Some of the policies implemented. The idea of a worldwide network of CIA prisons, the idea of extraordinary rendition, the idea of Guantanamo Bay, which I've heard you speak about. Did we go too far?
In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, the first responsibility the government had was to make sure there was not going to be a 9/13 or a 9/14. We didn't know what was out there. And so in those first weeks and months, we did everything we could to protect the country. And in so doing, we may have stretched what people thought we ought to be doing. And I think that in the years since, we have got to get back to the kind of procedures and legal systems that are more in keeping with our tradition. Thus, I had no problem with Guantanamo in the beginning. We needed a place immediately to put these folks. But over time, I think Guantanamo no longer served a purpose. And I think it was hurting us to have a place where people were held indefinitely without clear access to how to resolve their situation. Most of the people who went to Guantanamo were subsequently released. Some 700 of them went back home with no charges. And so I think that we would have been better served to close Guantanamo and bring these people into our civilian legal system. People say, well, no, that's not good. You don't want to bring them to the United States and they're going to be terrorists. Let me tell you what. You bring some of those guys to Rikers Island, or you put them out at a jail in Arizona, your problem isn't going to be they becoming terrorists again. It's how do you keep them alive overnight? And so I've never had that fear that they would sort of contaminate our entire legal system. Further, our civilian courts have demonstrated overwhelmingly that they can try these people and throw them in jail for long periods of time. They've been doing it. And so it's always been my view, even while I was Secretary of State, that Guantanamo initially had a purpose, but that purpose has been served, and we ought to get back to using our regular courts.
Do you support the black sites, the CIA black sites?
I don't comment on what the CIA does.
That's a good man, good man. General, thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you, Tony.
My pleasure.
Take care.